It doesn't have to be like these big grand moments either. It can be in those like small moments of someone being like, I felt joy because someone used my pronouns today, or I felt joy because I could exercise my bodily autonomy today.
The MMFC acknowledges that it carries out its work on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Peskotomuhkati peoples. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, and descendants of this land. We honor the knowledge keepers and seek their guidance as we strive to develop closer relationships with the Indigenous people in New Brunswick. Welcome to In Conversation, a podcast produced and hosted by the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre for Family Violence Research at the University of New Brunswick. Through this podcast, we hope to bring you insightful discussions with researchers, advocates, policymakers, and community members who are working to address the complex issues surrounding family and gender-based violence. The MMFC is a research center dedicated to advancing knowledge, fostering dialogue, and creating change through community-based participatory research. We provide an Atlantic Canadian perspective on research in the field of family violence and actively seek the participation of researchers from across the country and around the world. My name is Dr. Stefanie Hunt-Kennedy, and I'm the director of the MMFC. I am very excited for today's episode, which features Dr. Celeste Orr, an interdisciplinary scholar and fellow disability scholar, whose research is situated at the intersection of intersex, disability, and queer studies. In their award-winning book, Cripping Intersex, Dr. Orr investigates how intersex and interphobia intersect with disability and ableism. In doing so, Dr. Orr develops a new field of study, Cripping Intersex studies. Dr. Orr is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, the coordinator of the Gender and Women's Studies program, and the Wendy J. Robbins Professor in Gender and Women's Studies at the University of New Brunswick. They also sit on the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Center's board of directors. Welcome, Celeste.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so before we get started into the weeds of this research, maybe we can just start with a very simple introduction to intersex studies by asking you, what is intersex? It's not a familiar term to some folks. Can you just give us an explanation of what intersex is?
Yeah, so there are various definitions of intersex, or what many scholars and activists also refer to as variations in sex characteristics, or VSC. And what intersex is and how it ought to be defined has been debated for a long time, and it's still kind of up for debate. I talk about some of those debates in my book, but I think intersex activists and advocacy organizations offer really good, expansive, and non-stigmatizing definitions. So for example, Intersex Canada, a nonprofit organization that represents a diverse community of intersex people, families, and allies, they define intersex as, and I quote, an umbrella term to describe an array of variations to physical sex that may not be considered typically male or female. Those who are intersex have a difference to or mixture of sex characteristics, such as sex chromosomes, reproductive organs, external and internal genitalia, and or hormones. So intersex traits can be apparent at birth or may not become evident until puberty or later. So that's end quote. I also often look to Interact, advocates for intersex youth. They're based out of the States, and their definition is pretty similar. So an umbrella term for differences in sex traits or reproductive anatomy. Intersex people are born with these differences. There are many possible differences in genitalia, hormones, internal anatomy, or chromosomes compared to the usual two ways that human bodies, quote unquote, like typically develop. So some people with intersex variations can learn about their variations in childhood. Some are detected at birth. Some people find out during puberty because they weren't developing in the expected kind of ways. Some people might find out in adulthood during a routine medical exam or while they're trying to conceive. Some people also might never find out for a variety of reasons. So, for example, someone's chromosome formation, hormone levels, or internal gonads might never have been checked. A lot of ours haven't been checked, right? So their intersex variation may remain invisible or unknown to them. Medical professionals also have historically withheld intersex diagnoses from patients and parents. So some patients might never find out, and many have fought for sometimes many, many years to gain access to their medical records. And I think at least when I'm talking to my students and teaching my students about what intersex is, I also want to talk about what sex is, because it is really contested. I like to think of sex, or whatever characteristics we might want to define or classify as sex, as like a kaleidoscope. Oftentimes we'll see like the metaphor of like a spectrum used to describe sexuality or gender or sex. But I prefer the kaleidoscope metaphor over the spectrum metaphor, because the kaleidoscope, I think, better describes the kind of ever-changing nature relationship people can have with sex, the ever-changing cultural understandings of sex, and it's also circular. It doesn't have like two ends.
Yeah, right.
So people's bodies, what they learn about their bodies, their relationship to their bodies are ever-changing, like the kaleidoscope, and how human beings, culture, academic disciplines or policies conceptualize sex is also ever-changing.
It's also like blurry and beautiful.
Yeah, I like that too.
Right?
It is blurry and beautiful. I need to like buy a bunch of kaleidoscopes and like bring them to my class when I'm talking about this.
I love that.
Because I'll just have like images of kaleidoscopes, and like they are so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think that I like that addition. I also really like, or don't really like, the spectrum metaphor, because you'll see like quote unquote female on one end and like male on the other end. There isn't some objective like male or female category. Body parts aren't inherently gendered. So there's nothing inherently like masculine in a penis, or nothing inherently like feminine in an ovary. Humans are assigning gender to whatever we want to describe as sex, so like body parts generally. So in my teaching and my scholarship, I try and encourage folks to divest from gendered ideas around body parts. So when I define intersex or talk about quote-unquote biological sex, which I want to talk about that term in a minute too, I try to avoid expressions like male or female, or if I do, like place them in heavy scare quotes, because I really want to challenge dominant ideas of sex that, at the end of the day, harm us all to some degree, but particularly intersex, trans, genderqueer, and other like gender expansive folks.
I think that's really important, like, because I think we often see these kinds of binaries as an imposition on, as you say, queer, genderqueer, diverse folks, but really it's an imposition on all bodies.
Yeah.
But not everyone kind of realizes that or has the experience of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Or reflects on that even. Maybe they have had experiences, but they are not recognizing that that is where this is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, for a long time, like, scholars have been talking about how, like, gender and sex assignation is violent, because it's not just like, oh, you're a girl or you're a boy. It can come with, as we'll talk about later today, like all kinds of medical violence that can accompany it, but also all kinds of ideological and like cultural baggage that apparently like dictates everything about your life.
Yeah.
Your interests, like what you're going to do with your body, who you're attracted to, what hobbies you're going to pursue, what foods you're allowed to like. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And I want to talk also about the expression biological sex, because I really, really hate it. And so do other scholars. For example, Anna Posberg, whose research largely focuses on the violent exclusion of trans folks from sports, and I'm sure we'll talk about sports later too. She reminds us that biological sex is not an accurate phrase or term, and terms like biological female or biological male aren't really like medical terms in the way that people think that they are. But rather, these terms are used by organizations, like sports organizations, for example, and anti-trans activists use them to try and exclude and enact violence on intersex, trans, and gender-expansive people. And I want to quote Posberg directly. So she writes, quote, "Biological sex is not an accurate phrase, physiologically, physically, or endocrinologically, and is also a loaded political, cultural, and social phrase. While sex is assigned or determined by various biological characteristics, sex itself is not unquestionably rooted in biology." So she's reminding us that sex, like gender, is a social construction. yes, we all have body parts, but how we interpret those body parts is a cultural practice. So she continues using the example of the expression like biological male. Quote, biological male is not a medical term, but rather a term that sports organizations and anti-trans activists had put forward to reinforce exclusionary measures to keep trans people out of sports. So when I'm talking about intersex, I feel like it's important to talk about sex in this like broader way to really emphasize the sex binary, the quote-unquote male and female sex binary, isn't some objective truth or fact that, for example, intersex people undermine or like pathologically deviate from. It's a cultural artifact.
That's super helpful. And I think for some listeners might be like a kind of a difficult concept to kind of wrap their heads around. I'm sure we'll return to this to flesh it out even more. But I want to, before we move on, go back to something that you said about doctors. You said historically sometimes they withhold.
Yes.
So, like, why? Why is that? Why have they withheld intersex diagnoses, quote unquote, or information from patients?
Well, one of the main reasons is they assume that it's going to be too troubling or too traumatic information of being like, well, we don't want to tell this child or even necessarily their parents, because medical information has been withheld from parents as well, because they assume that it's so bad or so quote unquote freakish or so quote unquote deviant or pathological or also queer that we don't want to tell parents or we don't want to tell the child because it'll be too traumatic to learn about.
Disruptive.
But we also know through studies that not telling patients diagnoses does so much more harm in the long run. And there are also lots of accounts of intersex folks who found out aspects of their biologies or their diagnoses later and talk about how traumatic it was to learn that later and being like, I felt lied to for my whole life. Why didn't my parents or my medical professionals tell me this? There's also accounts of folks who spent a really sometimes we're talking several years trying to gain access to their medical documents, and then medical professionals saying, I don't want to release this to you because I think you'll hurt yourself or whatever. No other diagnosis does this happen to, of being I can't tell you this. But there's so much stigma and cultural anxieties around anything related to sex and gender and sexuality that it's medical ethics goes out the window.
Well, but also that the medical, the decision of medical professionals to withhold that information just further perpetuates that stigma.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And some medical professionals are changing and not advocating for secrecy and all of that. But it's still a problem.
Yeah. Okay, so that was a great explanation of these categories that we've become so attached to, right? These kind of binaries and sex and gender. I'm curious, as a disability historian, we often talk about disability as historically and culturally constructed. It's an embodied experience, but of course, what is deemed disability is, kind of shape shifts, right, throughout history. And so I'm curious to know, would you say that intersex is similarly historically and culturally constructed?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was really glad that you asked this question. I know before we started recording, we started kind of chatting about this. And I think anyone who really wants to learn more about why dominant culture conceptualizes quote unquote biological sex the way that we do, we really need to look to the past, because these ideas didn't just come out of thin air, right? There's long historical legacies and precedent. So when I teach about intersex issues and intersex justice, I think it's imperative to talk about these kinds of histories, because it can give us tools not only to understand why we believe what we believe now, but can give us tools of resistance too, which I know we'll talk about later. So how we understand, define, and classify body parts is a cultural process and endeavor, as we've already been underscoring. It's never and can never be objective. Objectivity doesn't exist. There's this great book, gosh, I don't remember who authored it now. Is it Daston and Callison? Just called, the book's just called Objectivity, and being people invented objectivity to just oppress people, the idea of objectivity.
Right.
So we would be here for weeks if we could offer a comprehensive history, and I alone also couldn't offer such a comprehensive history. So for today, I really wanted to outline some of the racist and colonial history of how sex, specifically genitals, have been and are still understood. So cultural, social, and political anxieties regarding sex and gender, specifically those who deviate or are assumed to deviate from like this white Western sex binary, has a long historical tradition. So Western European colonizers have been consistently imagining nations that are understood to be like racialized and racialized women as quote-unquote like sexually ambiguous for centuries. So for example, there's a long Western colonial, imperial, and scientific history of labeling African women's genitals, particularly South African women's genitals, as ambiguous, primitive, degenerate, or like quote like malconformed. Mm-hmm. And if you want to learn more about this, I really encourage folks to check out Amanda Locke-Squar's book, Envisioning African Intersex, Challenging Colonial and Racist Legacies in South African Medicine. And in my work, I also draw from Zine Megubane. She really informs my thinking, and she explains that, and I'll quote her, "One thing that South African, U.S., and European medical texts from the 17th century through to the 20th seemed to agree on was the fact that, quote-unquote, like malformed or ambiguous genitalia were particularly common among women of African descent." So there were many like white Western male European like quote-unquote experts. We can think of various examples: Theodore Waits, John Beck, George Cuvier, William Henry Flower, Adolf Otto, who all concluded that racialized women were more likely to be quote-unquote sexually ambiguous. And the supposed ambiguities like would include supposed like excessive clitoral length or labia minora visibility, and these experts further theorized that these differences, or supposed differences, were literal markers of these women's innate degeneration, primitivism, and perverse, insatiable sexuality. So we can see what's happening here is like these women are being like reduced to their genitals, or miraculously how white people are imagining their genitals to be. And these genitalia, or supposed genitalia, were used as justification for all kinds of like literal and discursive and epistemological dehumanizing racist violence, enslavement, experimentation, and so on.
Even like, it makes me think of Sarah Baartman.
Absolutely.
And in addition to those exploitations that you just mentioned, just the parading around, right? Like literally displaying her body, parading her around. Even after death, she did not have ownership of her body. Yeah. You know, it was in a French museum until very recently, right? Like in the last couple decades, it was finally returned. Yeah, and also like making her body available for all these European medical folks to poke and prod at. Yeah.
When I'm thinking about, that's why I think anti-interphobic scholarship really needs to draw from these and be informed by these racist histories and legacies, because when we're thinking about how biological sex has been understood, it's informed by, as you mentioned before, like ableism and like racism and colonialism, because of the assumption that to be human, or to be properly human, is to be properly sexed. And to be understood as properly sexed has been conflated with whiteness. Another part of the history that I think is worth mentioning too is like all of those authors who were like making these really racist conclusions, they didn't necessarily deny that European people can also have such traits, but they thought that warm or hot climates played a vital role in producing quote-unquote sexual ambiguity. So in addition to the assertion that these characteristics are literal markers of racialized women's degeneracy and like lower status on the evolutionary scales, they thought that temperature had a significant impact on how genitals developed, and warmer temperatures apparently led a woman to develop more barbaric, protruded, or visible genitalia, and then cooler temperatures led a woman to develop more advanced, desirable, or flat genitals. And I think for a lot of like contemporary folks, the suggestion that weather has any bearing on human genital development is likely really bizarre. But that also has a really long history, too. So, for example, Galen and Aristotle claim that women and men develop different genital formations due to temperature and humidity. Political science and philosophy scholar Georgia Warnke recounts that men's bodies were supposedly hot and dry, and women's bodies were supposedly cold and moist. And because they were, women's bodies lacked sufficient heat to force the organs to their proper place on the outside. So in the end, for Galen, who was also following Aristotle, women were simply imperfect outside-in men. If the body lacked the adequate warmth, it would become half-baked.
It's such a good example of how these are historically constructed.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you were living at the time, that's just what you would have believed about quote-unquote biological sex.
Yeah. And their own theories also, like, cause them to have some serious anxieties, too.
Right.
Because if temperature and, like, climate are a big thing, they're like, oh, no. If women, like, do manly activities that make the body heat up, there was the concern that her sex will, like, slip from her sexual anchorage.
Yeah.
And she'll, like, get a penis or whatever. Or, like, if she engaged in any kind of activities that were understood as manly, there was a concern that she'll transform.
Yeah. So then you're seeing this kind of connection between what they believed biological sex to be and then how it connected to gendered expectations.
Yeah.
And ideals and norms, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great teaching example.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And this kind of stuff persisted until the 20th century, and I argue in my book that it's still going on. So, like, this false connection between, like, race and supposed sexual ambiguity, we could look at texts that were published in the 20th century. So if we look at Godfrey Charlewood's work, he wrote in 1956 that intersex, quote-unquote, abnormalities were more frequent in black people and, quote, related races, which is not true. That's not how biology works. And in the late 1980s, geneticists Michelle Ramsey and colleagues similarly claimed that, quote, ambiguous genitalia seem to be much more common in blacks than whites. And this belief really impacted how intersex folks were, quote unquote, like, treated in medical settings, because of the assumption that to be white is to be properly sexed impacts how doctors then approached patients. So when surgery aimed at, like, quote unquote, like, fixing or curing intersex traits became common practice in the global north in the mid-20th century, the idea that black people were more likely to be, like, sexually, quote unquote, ambiguous was still being circulated. And Zine Maghubane writes about this, and I kind of want to quote her at length because it impacted how medical professionals approached intersex folks who were, like, white or black, for example. So she writes that surgery on white patients was, and I quote, imperative to establish the normality of whiteness. An ambiguously gendered white body needed to be corrected to retain its whiteness, whereas an ambiguously gendered black body was seen as confirming the essential biological differences between whites and blacks. Equally important was the need to use surgical correction to further secure the gender distribution of racially exclusive social privileges, such as the right to inherit and own property, the right to vote, the right to marry, and the right to education. Those social privileges were extended only to white people, and therefore it was a political imperative that their bodies be identified as either male or female, and once identified, be surgically and socially forced to conform. So that's end quote. So, like, white intersex people, as she's talking about, needed to be rendered invisible to maintain the myth of, like, white superiority, right? And medical interventions were presumed crucial for white intersex kids, so they could retain their whiteness and also their rights as white people. So even though most medical professionals now advocate for, quote-unquote, like, normalizing procedures for all people with intersex variations, and they don't maintain that racialized people are more likely to have intersex traits, I still think racist conceptions of sexual difference or sexual, quote-unquote, ambiguity or deviance are still being perpetuated. And we see this through the routine, like, masculinization of women of color, particularly black women, and we really see it in sports specifically. Racialized women athletes from the global south have been routinely charged with, like, quote-unquote, sexual ambiguity, kicked out of sport, subjected to non-consensual, invasive, and irreversible procedures, and been, like, dragged in the media. There's also another historical thing I want to briefly mention too, and people can check out a lot more of it in Elizabeth Reese's book, Bodies in Doubt, An American History of Intersex. And she writes about how intersex people, or historically they were pejoratively called, like, hermaphrodites, although some intersex folks will reclaim that term now, how they were understood to be deliberately deceptive or shady. And she writes about how intersex people were understood to be monsters. She describes them as, people would understand them to be brute animals. And there was the assumption that intersex folks were going to trick non-intersex or endosex people into illicit queer sexual liaisons. So I'll quote her directly. "Embedded in many of the medical accounts were worries going beyond the threat of dishonesty and illicit sexual relations to the far more troubling threat of inexplicable sexual transformation." So some folks believe like all of these cultural anxieties are swirling around and they're like, oh my goodness, intersex people can like shift back and forth between sexes and genders at will to like trick you. And then if folks are interested also in learning a little bit more about the history, Julie Greenberg's book, Intersexuality and the Law, is a really great resource because she talks about how the state or like cities or policies would try and navigate these cultural anxieties around sex and gender.
Right. You've already debunked so many kind of myths about bodies, biology, sex, intersex. But I'm wondering, what is a misconception about intersex that comes up in your research or your teaching that you really want to put to rest or correct? And then maybe as a follow-up to that, I'm curious about like pop culture discourse or kind of moments in popular culture and how these have contributed to misconceptions and the stigmatization of intersex people.
So I have a few examples that come to mind, and when it comes to the pop culture and media one, I want to talk a little bit more about sports stuff. But there are so many. We already talked about the assumption that they're shady and dubious and they're tricksters. But what I found in my teaching and research, or just like talking to people when they are like, what do you do kind of thing, is that there's still lots of people who don't think intersex people exist at all. They think of mythical creatures or monsters or gods. And I think this is really indicative of the fact that intersex people have been so thoroughly erased from like our history education, our biology education, from our policies, from our cultural consciousness, our cultural imaginaries, that for some folks it can be really inconceivable for them to recognize that intersex people exist. And because it can be, and we've kind of talked about this before, or gestured to it at least, but really hard for people to accept that the gender and sex binaries are a farce, that there isn't just penis and vagina, or ovaries and testicles, or testosterone and estrogen, and XX and XY. It shatters a lot of people's worldviews, and it should, right? Because those worldviews are incorrect and discriminatory and result in all kinds of violence. I've also had students in the past, when I teach about intersex issues and intersex justice, who became like really furious when they, like in a good way, became really furious when they learned about intersex issues because they felt really betrayed and lied to. They'd be like, my teachers never told me that, my parents never told me this,
right.
My professors never told me this. And I think that rage is a really great place to start. Like, we should be furious. People are being lied to. So I think for those of us who are striving to be allies and co-conspirators, like, what can we do with that rage and that anger now that we know better, right? Whether you're an educator, for example, like, what can you do? Donate, join things. Another thing that a lot of people assume is that intersex variations are really rare. Tiger DeVore, who's a clinical psychologist and sex therapist and intersex activist, he notes in the documentary Intersection that intersex variations are one of the most common congenital variations. Oftentimes you'll hear people say that intersex variations are about as common as red hair, so around like 1.7 to 2% of the population. And there are various estimates. From what I see is 1.7 to 4% of the population, but honestly I think it's probably a lot higher than that. In illustrating this, I often want to cite a 1995 study, which I think is really illuminating. It was conducted by Jan Fitchner and colleagues, and they conducted this study because they noticed a high prevalence of undiagnosed hypospadias in their patients. So hypospadias is an intersex variation where one's urethral meatus or pee hole isn't at the exact tip of the penis, but it can be situated on the underside. So it can appear near the head of the penis, but not at the tip. It can be middle or lower on the underside of the penile shaft. It can be where the penis and the scrotum join, or it can be behind the scrotal sac. So Fitchner and colleagues were noticing that a lot of their patients had undiagnosed hypospadias, and they wanted to conduct a study to see how common this variation is. And they also wanted to see if they're like, hey, intersex folks are often subjected to non-consensual medical interventions. Like, if this is so common, like, why are we doing this kind of thing? I'm not saying I agree with everything in their study. Obviously, I agree with outlawing intersex genital mutilation. But what they observed 500 people's penises, no diagnoses, and 45% of them had undiagnosed hypospadias, like meaning their pee hole wasn't at the exact tip of their penis. So they also remarked that the study participants didn't have complaints about cosmetic or functional aspects. So this study is just about one intersex variation, and there are at least 40 known different intersex variations. So when I hear people saying intersex traits are uncommon, or they'll say they're about as common as red hair, I'm always like, it's way more common than that. But it can be really hard for scholars and activists to actually gain access to medical statistics about, for instance, how often doctors give out diagnoses, because doctors don't want to release that information, because in doing so they will be releasing documentation about how common non-consensual surgeries are taking place, and in doing so it's an admission of human rights violations. So I didn't say this earlier, but intersex genital mutilation is legal in Canada, even though female genital mutilation is not, and it's legal all over the world, not necessarily everywhere, but broadly speaking it is. And the intersex genital mutilation is classified as torture by the United Nations, and the World Health Organization urges medical professionals to defer surgeries until folks are old enough to make a decision about their own bodies, and they also call for reparations for victims and survivors of intersex genital mutilation. So keeping that information private, like trying to keep those stats private, or also refusing to gather such information, is both a means to protect hospitals and doctors from criticism, and also a way to deny abuses.
That's great, Celeste. Thanks so much for all of that explanation. I'm also curious to know about the role of sport in terms of pop culture, and how sport has kind of contributed to these misconceptions and stigmatization.
Yeah. So I find, even though lots of people are like, oh, I don't really care about sports or whatever, but then they have like huge, strong opinions about sport when it comes to like sex and gender, and also disability too. And one of the big misconceptions is that people with intersex traits are unfairly advantaged in sports. And we've seen it time and time again, particularly women athletes of color from colonized nations being banned, humiliated, picked apart in media because they're assumed to be intersex, and then in turn they're assumed to have an unfair advantage in sport. So first off, we can definitely draw connections between the racist colonial history that we were talking about earlier. And also it's important to note that sport can never be fair. This is just not how it's going to work, given the historical and contemporary social, economic, and cultural arrangements of sport. And I find it so fascinating that there's no concern with fairness when it comes to certain athletes in wealthier countries or neighborhoods or families who've had or have had their entire lives greater access to expensive training, technology, nourishing food, equipment, and healthcare. But then, right when it comes to questions of like sex and gender, or ability or disability, it's like a huge concern. Yeah,
it's like they put all the emphasis on the body and not socioeconomic factors. It's all about
factors.
Right. It's all about what you were quote unquote gifted with, like in your body.
And like when I think of that too, like I'm like, there's so many physical advantages: extreme tallness, increased hemoglobin levels, increased oxygen capacity, which all, by the way, have specific diagnoses. There's no concern with that. I'm going to be crap at basketball because I'm 5'3" and haven't been training and don't care about basketball, not because of like some innate unfairness. So the assumption basically is that like women are innately worse at sports. Women just suck at sports and they'll inevitably lose to men, or whoever the powers that be decide are men, right? So we see sexism and ableism intersecting here, that women are less able just simply because they're women, and anxieties around femininity and athleticism because of idealized understandings of femininity, like women are supposed to be small and dainty and not athletically inclined. So we have sex testing and sex segregation in sport under this guise of failure and like quote unquote protecting women from apparently all these men who are going to come in and like masquerade as women, or protecting quote unquote like normal women, but when they're talking about like normal women they mean like cis women, from trans women who are basically deemed men by sport governing bodies, and also intersex women. And there's a really long history of sport sex testing, and I won't get into it all here. You can look it up in my book if you really want, and you can also look up Anna Posberg's work too if you're interested in learning more about the science, because I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on that. But one of the biggest concerns that people have with intersex athletes, particularly intersex women athletes, is all the anxiety around like testosterone. People assume that intersex women inevitably have high levels of testosterone and that their body metabolizes it and uses it, and that testosterone is like the master molecule of athleticism and like the only thing that makes people good at sports. But it's just simply not the case. Katrina Karkazis and Rebecca Jordan-Young, they have a book about this called Testosterone. It's really great. But in some of their research, they talk about like one glaring clue that all of this is nonsense is that women whose tissues do not respond to testosterone at all are actually overrepresented among elite athletes, meaning women whose bodies have testosterone, right? Because everybody's got it, but don't respond to it or recognize it are overrepresented. As counterintuitive as it might seem, there's no evidence that successful athletes have higher testosterone levels than less successful ones. So women with low levels of T often beat women with high levels of T. Endosex women can beat intersex women. Cis women often beat trans women. There's just no evidence to suggest that athletic abilities are purely a matter of or extend exclusively from sex, however you want to define it. Chromosomes, testosterone, genital formation, none of it. There just isn't the science there to support this discriminatory policy. I also want to say one more thing before we move on from sports, because oftentimes when I'm teaching this to my students, they're like, but bodies are real. The materiality of bodies are real. And I don't deny that, right? But things are just so much more complicated than the sex binary. And it's also worth noting that there are men who have like more in common biologically, like for example muscle mass or height or weight, with women than other men, and vice versa. And we're really in the habit of thinking in binaries, but binaries always like fail us in the long run. And I guess that's the end of that sentence.
So I'm curious to know, like in the scholarship that you're citing, which by the way, thank you so much, and I feel like we should have a list of references attached to this because now I have a reading list. Do scholars criticize the like men's sports, women's sports? Even that binary?
Oh,
like,
for sure.
Like, what do scholars in your field imagine as an alternative to that, which we've become so comfortable with, right? So familiar with. So, not that people have to have an answer, but like, is there a kind of envisioning of what it could be?
In my own work, I do advocate that sport should be desegregated in the long run. There are some concerns that some scholars have raised, being like, okay, if we like desegregate sport tomorrow, what would happen? Probably a lot of sexist and racist stuff would happen. And there's the assumption that there would probably be a lot of like women and marginalized athletes who would be pushed out of sport, because we've been seeing that the whole time, right? Already. Right. So at least what I posit, and some other scholars posit, that there need to be made, like a lot of changes need to be made for that to actually be a successful long-term project of things like, well, outlawing sports sex testing. I know there are recent sports sex testing policies that are out, and they're terrible, and they're basically like super transphobic and endosexist. Ensure that there are more supports for all athletes, particularly women athletes and gender diverse athletes and trans athletes and intersex athletes at all levels. Like trying to work against the cultural assumption that women suck at sport, right? Working against those assumptions. Ensuring that there's like more grants and equitable pay for athletes. A lot more support for athletes who are trying to retain like visas for traveling to certain places. But I also think that it's important to consider desegregating sport around ability, because it's underpinned by like the ableist assumption that disabled people are just inevitably going to be shitty at sports, when this isn't the case, right? And do you remember when Oscar Pistorius ran? Mm-hmm. And that was like in the Olympics and not the Paralympics, and everybody, the discourse around disability shifted significantly.
Yeah.
Because the justification for segregating by disability is ableist, of being like, oh, well, disabled athletes are just not going to be as good and they'll inevitably lose, which is like so paternalistic and so ableist. But then when Oscar Pistorius ran, it shifted. He has an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
All of a sudden.
Right.
So we're seeing the ill logic that sports governing bodies use at the end of the day to be really exclusionary, sexist, racist, interphobic, ableist, and so forth. So yeah, I think a long-term goal would be reimagining the sports world, and also like what sporting culture would even look like outside of a capitalist framework that's rooted in exploitation.
That's awesome. I love the imagining a different path. Right? You've mentioned a couple times these non-consensual medical interventions, right? And both disabled people and intersex people have both been subjected to these non-consensual surgeries and aimed at, quote unquote, curing or fixing their bodies. Can you explain a little bit about what these medical procedures are for intersex people and how have they changed over time?
So I mentioned earlier that in the mid-20th century is when like non-consensual surgeries on intersex patients started to take off, and it was largely because of John Money's theories around gender and sex. And even though Money's theories have been proven false, we still see the assumption that trying to cure intersex folks is the way because of racism and queerphobia and all of the things that we've been talking about. So without a doubt, like non-consensual medical interventions are violent. They've been described as experimental, sexual assault, abuse, invasion, medical rape by those who have been subjected to them. And they can also be really disabling. They can result in myriad forms of like short or long-term disability, such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, loss of genital sensation or ability to orgasm, incontinence, anesthetic neurotoxicity, chronic infection, genital pain, and so forth. And I think it's really important to name those consequences, and we know of them not because of doctors volunteering this information, but because of intersex people, intersex activists and advocates and intersex organizations who've been sharing their experiences. And like intersex studies as a field only exists because of intersex activism, similar to, as you know, disability and mad studies is because of activism. And the intersex advocacy organizations have been and are continuing to do so much outstanding like educational and destigmatizing policy and healthcare work, and it's really transnational. And I want to name a few, so like folks can look them up if they want. But there's like Intersex Canada, Interact, I think I mentioned them before, Brila Intersexual in Mexico, Intersex Belgium, Intersex Denmark, Intersex Human Rights Australia, Intersex Persons Society of Kenya, Intersex Asia, Intersex Russia, Strategy Lab for Intersex Movements, Organization Intersex International. Like there's so many folks around the world, and I encourage people to go onto Intersex Canada's website. They have a link. It's called International Map of Intersex Organizations. And when you look at this map, it's a map of the world, and it's covered in dots all over the place, like indicating all the places where intersex activism and advocacy is taking place. So we can learn more and donate and see how they can assist in any work. And like everything that I'm saying today is because of this kind of work. It's because I've learned directly or indirectly from these like intellectual giants, these activists and creatives and scholars who've been doing this work for decades. And if folks want to learn more specifically around like the history of intersex activism, Juliana Gleason's new book, Hermaphrodite Logic, A History of Intersex Liberation, is a really, really great resource. Awesome. But honestly, anybody listening who's invested in bodily autonomy, being like people should be able to make their own decisions about their own bodies for themselves, should be actively opposed to intersex genital mutilation.
Because what's happening, to be clear, is that a baby is born, and then if the medical professionals deem that body to be ambiguous in terms of genitalia, they make a decision. Is that right? They make a decision based on that binary of male and female, and then do quote unquote corrective surgery to align that body as closer to one of those binaries, right? Of those two categories.
Yeah, for sure. And it's around, like, again, stats are a tricky thing. They say, like, around 1 in 2,000 infants are born with genitalia that's variant, right? So it can be apparent at birth. But invasive medical procedures could happen at any point in someone's life. Could be, like, removing somebody's gonads, which basically sterilizes a person and prompts the person to always need hormone replacement therapy because they're like those things are gone. The intervention could be just hormones and not surgery.
And like disability, you know, the logic that undergirds these medical, I don't even want to call them interventions because it gives it too much credit, these medical traumas, or as you say, they're invasive, etc. The logic that undergirds them is this kind of ableist fantasy that everyone wants to be non-disabled, or everyone wants to be non-intersex or endosex. Is that the right term?
Yeah.
And by that logic, that all of these variations are bad.
Yeah.
Right? And dislodging that idea that these things are not quote unquote bad, that they're not individual problems, they're not these tragedies, is still so difficult for a lot of people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah.
And these things are constantly perpetuated and reinforced through this insistence that these bodies, you know, are quote unquote fixed.
Yeah. And we've seen, like, the discriminatory logic, like, shift with time. Like, earlier we were talking about, like, how racism and colonial logics really impacted how, like, sex is understood, and that impacted also, like, quote-unquote treatment of intersex kids. And then we'd see, like, a shift to explicitly mobilizing, like, queerphobic logic of being like, oh, we need to fix these people because what if their bodies don't facilitate, like, heterosexual penis and vagina sex? Like, oh no, the horror. Like, you know? And now, like I argue in my book, we're seeing ableist logic being explicitly mobilized, that intersex traits are being narrated explicitly as, like, disabilities, diseases, and disorders. And, like, the umbrella medical term is disorders of sex development, or some people say differences in sex development. And that institutionalization of that term, and I'm pretty sure it was 2006, I really hope I didn't get that wrong, was really contested, because certainly some people, like some intersex folks, are like, I'm going to use this medical term and that's fine and that suits me. But there were also a lot of intersex activists and intersex study scholars who were like, oh no, this is going to give so much more authority to medical professionals. It's really pathologizing, and it's really ableist, right? Like, it can function in really ableist ways. I'm not saying that people who want to use that term are, like, ableist at all, but just the assumptions and all of that come with it has and can function to remove intersex folks' bodily autonomy.
Yeah. And I think it's important, again, and I know we're talking about different kinds of medical procedures and the kind of overlapping experiences of disability and intersex when it comes to this kind of experience. But I think it's important to point out that, like, you know, there is nuance to this, that some medical procedures can help people who are in, for instance, like, chronic pain, right? Or to function in a way that suits their, you know, their life, their daily life better. But it's the insistence that just by their very nature that these bodies need to be fixed. Yeah. And as you point out, the irony is that often these result in chronic pain and disability, etc., right? Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, that's like, really fascinating.
Just to echo your point, like, I'm not saying, like, oh, everything, like, I think non-consensual things need to be
100%
outlawed and banned 100%, because if someone is like, I want to get this done for, you know, their reasons, great.
Yeah.
Here are the risks, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
go for it. Like
Informed consent.
Informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Louder for people in the back. So, to connect this to questions of gender-based violence, I'm curious to know if you understand these medical procedures as acts of gender-based violence.
Yeah, I think that like intersectional mutilation and all the other like non-consensual procedures that medical professionals inflict and some parents or proxies agree to can be understood through that like gender-based violence framework because they're violently imposing sex and gender, right? Mm. And I think I said this earlier, but it's like this kind of thing I think about when I think about like gender assignation or like sex assignation, even verbally is a violent thing. I'm not like a gender-based violence researcher, maybe in the traditional kind of sense, and I haven't really necessarily narrated my work through that framework, but I think that those who do gender-based violence research, I encourage them, I guess, to like incorporate like an anti-interphobic politic, an anti-ableist politic, an anti-racist politic. That would be fantastic, right? So long, obviously, as it's informed, led by, incorporates intersex folks themselves. And the violence that intersex people experience, too, isn't just relegated to like a medical context. Yeah. And I think that's where some gender-based violence researchers' expertise could be really useful. Yeah. Like it can be in the home, it can be at school, it can be at work, it can be in bathrooms, it can be on a form. Yeah. Right? Yep. How endosexism impacts people throughout their lives also really varies. And there's some really exciting new research specifically around like the life course. Yeah. Because, if how one is navigating an endosexist world is going to be different than when you're in an elementary school and young than when you're in middle age or when you're in a retirement home. Mm-hmm. And for folks interested in exploring that, you can check out Surya Monroe, Adeline Berry, Morgan Carpenter, and Sean Saifa Wall's book, Intersex Variations of Sex Characteristics, DSD, Critical Approaches. They have some really great work in there specifically talking about like the life course in that way. And also Adeline Berry's book, it's just out for pre-order. It's called Intersex Ageism and Intersectionalities. Cool. So I think that like there are so many avenues that like maybe like more traditional gender-based violence researchers can use their expertise to advocate for intersex people's human rights, their safety, their autonomy.
Yeah, that's great, and I think it's important, as you say, to consider that GBV lens in and beyond the medical world, right? Yeah. That intersex people are also subjected to gender-based violence outside of this kind of medical, industrial kind of...
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've been talking a lot about violence and kind of heavy stuff, physical violence, and which, of course, is incredibly important, but recognizing that focusing, solely on pain and suffering kind of risks reducing intersex to a kind of one-dimensional lived experience. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about intersex joy.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because just a couple of months ago, my friend and colleague Casey Burkholder, our co-edited special collection in feminist theory, just came out and it's titled On Intersex Joy. And you're right, it was kind of the impetus of the project that so often we'll see intersex people's lives be reduced to trauma and pain, and they can become really one-dimensional. And I was thinking about starting a project on intersex joy for a bit, because prior to starting that special issue in 2024, and it just came out in April, I noticed that there was some emerging scholarly and activist discourse around intersex joy specifically. Mm-hmm. There was also burgeoning like joy studies too, like we're seeing lots of scholarship and activist work around Black joy and Indigenous joy and Digiqueer joy, disability joy, Crip joy, queer joy, and so forth. And what I was noticing, I'm not really on social media, but I do lurk sometimes, namely on Reddit, which it can be wild on there. But that's beside the point. But I would see some posts or like videos or questions about intersex joy. And a couple years prior, intersex activist Hans Lindahl posted a video on YouTube about intersex joy. featuring intersex folks and activists discussing what intersex joy means to them. It's a really great video. People should look it up. In 2024, Sean Saifa-Wall was asked to create like a joy list. Interact advocates for intersex youth also have an intersex joy section on their webpage that marks good news, stories of intersex people feeling whole and connected and in community. And there's also some emerging scholarship too, a couple publications here and there that were coming out and addressing intersex joy. So for me, for a few years, I was like I was taking note of this kind of work, and I was thinking about what intersex joy can and does add to dominant discussions about intersex people, embodiments, and so on. And I was also thinking of the limits of my own scholarship. I'm like, oh wow, like I haven't been attending to this either, and it is important to do so. So as like a trained feminist scholar, I was really interested in what might happen when feminist scholarship concerning joy and happiness was placed in conversation with recent thinking about intersex joy or the recent call or turn toward joy. Because feminist scholarship concerning happiness and joy, largely speaking, is pretty silent on intersex joy or intersex issues broadly speaking. So I was excited to see what would happen. So I asked Casey Burkholder, whose research primarily concerns joy studies and queer joy, to do this project with me. And she agreed. And one of the conversations that we had was how not thinking about joy can be really seductive. Like we might think we're really smart for like refusing or distancing from joy, you know, like look around, what's there to be joyful about? If you're feeling happy, you're not with it or whatever. And I think also if we don't expect joy, then we maybe won't be disappointed by its absence. And also lots of folks can be suspicious of joy, viewing those who experience it or those who are invested in it as frivolous or ignorant, especially like now, during a time we're seeing rising fascism and genocides and increased queerphobia and endosexism and transphobia and AI's here. Like, it's rough, right? But we think that joy is really crucial, maybe even especially when times are hard and traumatizing. So we were drawing from some of the theorizing of Steph Schuster and Laurel Westbrook. And they write, if scholars do not attend to joy, they cannot contribute to knowledge about how to foster it. This is perilous, even for sociologists interested in only problems, as joy can help combat issues such as stigma and negative self-esteem. Moreover, focusing only on the adverse aspects of being a part of a marginalized group may actually harm members of those groups, as it perpetuates beliefs that marginalized people live in misery. Telling narratives only of negativity contributes to the construction of unlivable lives. So we were thinking with this, and we invited folks to contribute to it, and I'm really proud of it. And I want to talk about some of the contributions in the what is it, the special issue. So David Griffiths and Marta Prandelli, they have an article in the special issue called Beyond the Deficit, From Damage to Desire in Intersex Studies. And they're calling for a complex theorizing of joy that offers intersex studies a language around contradiction and nuance and complexity, because all of these things can exist at the same time. So they're offering a desire-based approach that intersex studies can take up. There's also an article authored by Fabian Jimenez Gatto called Intersex Appeal, and it describes the expansiveness of intersex happiness that pushes beyond, like normative and heteronormative and cis-heteronormative scripts. And Gatto explores affirmative, charming, and really beautiful representations of intersex people, where intersex embodiments are framed in desirous and joyful ways. There's also an article by Carrie Gabriel Costello called The Joy of Intersex, Escaping the Cage of Dreary Heteropatriarchal Sexuality. And Costello suggests that the binary sex is really a trap. It's like a heteropatriarchal cage. And in this light, intersex embodiment offers not a problem to be fixed, but a potential path to freedom. And I mentioned Sean Saifa-Wall a couple times already, but he has a really great article in it called Finding Joy Through Black Intersex Resistance. And Wall explores opportunities and limits of joy as a framework to respond to trauma and medical violence that dominates intersex studies. Importantly, Wall asks us, what does intersex joy look like when intersex people do not benefit from legal protections and recognition? And how do intersex people claim joy when intersex children and young adults are still subject to state violence? So alongside these questions, Wall examines his own family archive and shows examples that highlight Black intersex resistance to medical hegemony during Jim Crow in the southern USA. And he puts forward an examination of the violence of medical archives and also foregrounds a template for Black intersex resistance. There's also, I want to mention one more contribution too.
Yeah, of course.
One of my former students, Tori Dudas, myself, and Casey, we worked on an article for that special issue 2, and we try and center intersex joy we center intersex joy in conversation with Crip, queer, Indigenous, and Black joy, and we're trying to envision what would a liberatory timescape or life course look like in a anti-endo-sexist world. And Christopher Brew also contributed a conversation with Casey and I where Brew talks specifically about what intersex joy feels like and looks like. I want to extend this project a little bit more, but I'm hoping that that's the end.
Yeah, I really...
I lost my train of thought.
That's all right.
You can leave that in.
I really appreciate that. I think that conversations, discussions, scholarly discussions around joy, as you say, it's reaching into multiple fields.
Joy can't do everything, obviously. But I showed some videos about joy in one of my classes this past winter term. I really wanted to explore rage and joy, so I had a special topics class that explored rage and joy, and it was really interesting. And we watched a video. It was on the week we were talking about trans joy, with trans folks talking about trans joy, right? Mm-hmm. Being this brings me joy, and it can be it doesn't have to be these big grand moments either. It can be in those small moments of someone being I felt joy because someone used my pronouns today, or I felt joy because I could exercise my bodily autonomy today, or.
I think that's a really good point, and as a historian, so not to plug my work, but
plug away.
In Cripping the Archive, we also kind of attend to this because, by and large, the stories that are told in that book are kind of depressing, and so to think about Crip joy, right? And as my collaborator Jennifer Barclay and I, we were thinking about as historians, even joy itself is historically contingent.
Totally.
And to your point, sometimes it looks completely mundane to some, right? But it doesn't have to look a particular way. And definitely in historical context, what does joy look like in, under the institution of slavery? Yeah. It's going to look different than in a different historical context. So, I think we're on the verge of just nerding out at this point, but...
Well, and I think, too, the work that you do and prompts questions, too, around, who has access to joy, under what conditions? And, who has access to certain emotions, too? Mm-hmm. When we think about anger, or when we think about joy, who's allowed kind of socially to display those emotions without potential violent reactions, you know? I'm kind of in the beginning stages of a project about the uses and limits of intersex joy because, joy can do a lot of things, and it can be really resistive, claiming joy and experiencing joy. It can inspire us and motivate us and bring folks together and can prompt, cool scholarly or activist collaborations, although joy doesn't have to, be quote-unquote, generative and productive in, any kind of neoliberal sense. But, I think that... So I want to keep thinking with this because it's been changing the way that I've been teaching and thinking about the projects that I want to do. Because when I first started thinking more seriously with joy, I was oh my gosh, I would have written my book so differently. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I think that's such a good moment and feeling when you're I would have done that completely differently with what I know now. I'm oh good, at least I'm still learning things.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to that future Dr. Orr work on joy. As a concluding question, I wonder if you could tell us, how do you, Dr. Celeste Orr, how do you find joy in the midst of this important but at times really heavy research?
Well, I'm always open to suggestions if you have any. But yeah, it's tough right now. So I said earlier, like rising fascism, ongoing discrimination against intersex and trans folks and disabled folks, there's environmental disasters, racism, colonialism, genocides, and so forth. So yeah, it's rough. It's rough out there. But honestly, like I got it pretty good. I'm privileged in all kinds of ways. I'm a white endo-sex scholar with a tenure-track job, and I get to like go home to like a loving home after work. And I think despite like some structural stuff, like as a queer disabled person, I get to surround myself with like wonderful supportive folks. But I think anyone who studies or teaches about violence, like whatever kind of violence you're thinking about, epistemic violence, representational violence, physical violence, curative violence, all of those things, particularly folks with lived experiences, it can be a struggle. One of the ways I've been trying to find joy is shifting a little bit in my teaching and my research. Like I mentioned earlier, I've been really intentional in bringing conversations around joy and happiness and abundance and pleasure into the classroom, and encouraging students to like work against sometimes the way education can frame marginalized folks as always and already like doom and gloom and only sad and misery all of the time. I'm trying to wrap up a second book project with my buddy, Nick Herenek. He's a historian. You should chat. And it's heavy. It's hard. Like it's about how queer folks in Canada anticipate violence, and it can be really hard engaging with certain collaborators' testimonies. You know, so I'm always open to people's suggestions, but like I try and find joy. One way I do that is I have pretty strict boundaries with work. No emails after 5 or before 9. I'm never looking at it on the weekend, so I can try and carve out that space for like myself and my home life. I go outside, I play Dungeons and Dragons with my buddies, which is really fun. My cats bring me a lot of joy. They're so freaking cute. I want to smush their faces all the time. How do you do it? What do you do?
I mean, I definitely think I agree that we really don't talk enough about the effective toll that these that a lot of our research can take, especially as you say, like the effective toll, for instance, in my case of a disabled scholar engaging with an archive that is incredibly violent toward disabled people, right? Like the effective toll that can take. And you know, we can throw around these terms of like collective care and like self-care and stuff like that. I know these are terms that we can kind of throw around, but they are actually meaningful, you know, to try and practice and learn more about.
Yeah, but the archive point too, because my friend Nick, he's at Thompson Rivers University, by the way, if anybody wants to Google him. He was doing some archival work for our book recently, because we're in part, like, because we have our collaborators, their testimonies, and we're placing basically like how they talk about anticipating like queerphobic violence in conversation with archives, right? How were Canadians in the 70s, 80s, 90s, how is this anticipation of violence being represented in like magazines, for instance, or in like the body politic, for instance? And he did some work recently, and then I'm like reading some of it, and I'm like, geez, Nick's in the archives doing this. It's just like so heavy, and I'm just reading it at my house. Yeah, and it can be like really graphic and scary, and then like seeing basically our study participants saying the same stuff is.
There's a great disability scholar named Grayson Brillmeyer who writes about, in the case of disability, of they're an archival studies scholar, and they write about that kind of the experience of, you know, engaging with an archive where disability specifically is, you know, so entwined with violence and harm, right? And I think, as you point out, like in terms of like how do we practice, I mean, joy, or even just like, I think coping mechanisms, right? Like if we can even,
I'll strive for that.
Yeah, exactly. Even if we can like lower the bar, you know, I think it can be from like the very kind of trivial to the very,
grand,
yeah, and like intentional. Like I remember on my first archival trip as a doctoral student, my supervisor said, you know, when you return from the archive, like watch brain candy TV.
Yeah, oh, I do
like
that.
Really, and I still stand by that's like a good practice of like just trying to really escape into a different headspace, because the work is really hard. And yeah, I think these are good questions to have. I think like honestly asking these questions of like, how do we do this and take care of ourselves and take care of each other?
Sometimes I'll say
those questions alone are so important.
Sometimes I'll say to my partner, I'll just be like, I gotta go look at a tree.
Yeah.
Like that's like my shorthand of like, I need to go and like see a thing and look at a tree. And like, I know you mentioned earlier, like community. I was in a meeting with some like awesome intersex activists and intersex studies scholars just last week, and it's fresh in my mind. And like, you know, that was really like amazing just to like hear all of the work that they're doing. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like so encouraging and generative. And you know, it was like not all day long or whatever, a couple of hours, but and so many folks were like, oh, we got to do this again. And I was like, this would be so nice, because it is really nice to touch base with folks, especially because, I don't know, at least like where I'm specifically geographically located, like not many folks are doing the same kind of work that I'm doing.
Yeah. Okay, well, you know, it's a work in progress, this taking care and finding joy in the midst of heavy research. Celeste, it's been an absolute pleasure, or shall I say joy, to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your insight, for, again, really kind of, I feel like this episode has really been like truly informative for a lot of people. And it's going to challenge the way that folks kind of think about bodies, about these categories, these constructed categories that we cling to as a society, and the relationship between that kind of structural violence and gender-based violence and all sorts of connections. So thank you so much.
I hope so. Bodies are so cool and neat, you know?
They really are. And with that...